afternoon. My name is Natalie Madeira Cofield, entrepreneur in resident for Mayor Muriel Bowser presents 202Creates. In response to the changing business landscape, we are proud to launch our masterclass series featuring business creatives in the District of Columbia and established entrepreneurs who have achieved great success in business to inspire and inform the district's creative economy and community. An initiative of the DC Office of Cable Television, Film, Music, and Entertainment, led by director Angie M. Gates, 202 Creates is an entrepreneurship-focused initiative designed to celebrate, support, promote, and educate the district's growing creative community. 202 Creates produces entrepreneurship programming, provides technical assistance, masterclasses, and seminars, and produces biannually a cohort-modeled business-intensive residency program designed to aid creatives in scaling their endeavors. For more information, please visit us online at www.202creates.com. Now, I'd like to kick off today's program by introducing our featured speaker, Steve Case, founder and CEO of Revolution. Steve is one of America's best known and most accomplished entrepreneurs and a pioneer in making the internet part of everyday life. For the past 15 years, Steve's focus has been on starting and scaling Revolution, the Washington, D.C.-based investment firm that now backs entrepreneurs at every stage of their development. Revolution has invested nearly $1 billion in growth stage companies, including Sweetgreen, Tempest, Tala, DraftKings, and Clear, among others. Steve's entrepreneurial career began in 1985 when he co-founded AOL, America Online. Under Steve's leadership, AOL became the world's largest and most valuable internet company, helping to drive the worldwide adoption of a medium that has transformed business and society. AOL was the first internet company to go public and is the best performing stock of the 1990s, delivering nearly 11,000% return to its shareholders. At its peak, nearly half of internet users in the United States used AOL. In 2000, Steve negotiated the largest merger in business history, bringing together AOL and Time Warner in a transaction that gave AOL shareholders a majority stake in the combined company. Thank you for joining us, Steve. We are honored to have you with us today. I know I provided a brief background on you by reading your biography, but I'd love if you could just share with us a little bit more about how you got started along your technology journey.
Well, first of all, it's great to be with Natalie and be part of the whole, kind of DC-focused, innovation-focused series of sessions. My journey was a little bit circuitous. I graduated from college in 1980. I was interested at the time in the idea of the internet, but there really weren't internet companies to go to work for back then. It was still more of a concept than a reality. There wasn't much of a startup culture, frankly, back then. Somebody coming out of college wasn't able to raise venture capital. It was a different time. So I worked for some large companies, one in Procter & Gamble in Ohio, then a division of PepsiCo in Kansas. Did that for a few years and then moved to the DC area in 1983. Joined a startup that was in Tyson's Corner area that promptly failed. So my first experience in the startup world was not a great one, but thankfully, two of the people I met at that company, I started America Online in 1985, so 35 years ago this summer. And so back then, I remember when we started, only 3% of people were online, and those 3% were online an average of 1 hour a week. So when we said we wanted to, get America Online, we were serious about it. Of course, now we're living in a world where we're always online sadly because of the pandemic and other things. And so we've gone from a world where essentially nobody was connected, or very few people were connected, and they were connected very infrequently. To now essentially everybody's connected and increasingly ubiquitously. So it's been interesting to watch. And as you know, the DC region has really played a pivotal role in driving the internet. Not just companies like AOL, but some communications companies that in the 70s and 80s were quite instrumental, like MCI. And the internet itself was essentially birthed in the DC region by DARPA, the Defense Research Agency, that provided the initial funding that created the internet. So the role that not just companies like AOL played, but more broadly the regions play in starting and scaling the internet isn't really well understood in many parts of the country, but we should all be proud of that role.
I love that you mentioned the role that the DC region and DC specifically have kind of played in the technological revolution, because I don't think that people oftentimes think of the internet and technology as it relates to DC as much as they should. And so that's great. And that's one of the reasons why we're excited to hear from you. Steve, you talked a little bit about your background and your experiences. And in that time from founding AOL to today, what are some technological revolutions that you have seen that have kind of spun out of your role, kind of founding AOL and being a part of the internet boom?
Well, it really starts with those, first days, what I think of as the first wave of the internet, trying to educate people about the benefits, trying to create the on-ramps to get people online, trying to create the services that made it attractive to be online. And that really was a 20-year or so kind of chapter, kind of the most of the 80s, most of the 90s was simply getting people, connected. That really set stage for what I think of as a second wave of the internet, really the last 20 years, which because in that first wave, we kind of built the infrastructure and got everybody online. The second wave was building on top of the internet. And that's where companies like Facebook and Google, really software companies, have become so prominent. Now we're kind of entering the third wave of the internet, where it's going to be integrated much more seamlessly in our everyday life and impact different sectors of our economy, healthcare, food and agriculture, smart cities, things like that. And it's going to require, I think, a different mindset, kind of a different playbook for entrepreneurs. Partnerships are going to matter more. Policy is going to matter more. Perseverance is going to matter more. What I call the three Ps. And I think DC, this region more broadly, has a real advantage as we move from the second wave into the third wave. What happened in the first wave is it was fairly regionally distributed. Companies like AOL were obviously in the DC area. IBM's PC operations were in Boca Raton, Florida. Dell started up in Austin. Microsoft started up in Seattle. Sprint, the communications company, was in Kansas City. Hayes, the big communications modem company, was in Atlanta. It was fairly distributed. But in the second wave, when it became less about building the internet itself and more on building apps on top of the internet, that's where Silicon Valley really became prominent, even dominant in that second wave. But I think in the third wave, because of some of the dynamics I mentioned, partnership policy, et cetera, it's going to shift again. And the DC region has a huge opportunity to really lead the way in the third wave. That's one of the things we're excited about at Revolution.
I love it. So, talk to us about where we are today. So we're obviously in the middle of the pandemic. And as you've kind of talked about the evolution of technology and the internet and building on top of it, and seeing that the future looks like there's far more integration of technology adoption across all components of one's lifestyle, from education throughout to healthcare and beyond. What would you give as advice to founders who are either thinking of starting up businesses during this pandemic time, or people who are thinking of how do I successfully pivot my business so that I can sustain during this moment and then be prepared for the future of life after pandemic? What advice would you give them?
Well, I think it starts with, if you have an existing business, you have to figure out some way just to, frankly, stay alive. And so it's sort of a triage, manage through the crisis, sometimes kind of hunker down, make sure you don't run out of cash. A bunch of different things that people have had to do, particularly in the spring and summer time frame. So it's a real strong focus on just kind of managing, and in some cases for the companies that are not well capitalized, just trying to, survive. But I think we're now moving into a somewhat different phase where it's not just about managing, it's also about imagining exactly what you're saying. What is changing because of this? Some of those changes may just be temporary, and at some point, things go back to some form of what some call normal. But some of these may be more permanent, and trying to understand 5-10 years from now, whatever you're focused on as an entrepreneur, whatever industry you're trying to improve, disrupt, et cetera, what is your theory of what it might look like, down the road, and focus on that. There's a hockey player, Wayne Gretzky, that was famously, that the reason he was so good at playing hockey is he didn't focus on where the puck was. He focused on where the puck was going and got there just a little bit before somebody else. So part of the entrepreneurial journey, particularly in this, kind of pandemic world, is to have a sense of where the puck is going and try to position yourself, your company, for what's going to happen next, not just what's happening, today. And there clearly are a number of trends I do think are going to end up being, permanent. We've seen a a lot of innovation required over the last 6 months in healthcare, including around telehealth, the ability to access doctors virtually as opposed to having to go into the office. It wasn't safe to go in the offices in many cases, so people had to embrace telehealth. They realized, both the doctors and the patients, that it generally works pretty well. And so that's an example of something that likely will be a more permanent change. Eventually, people will start going back to doctors' offices, but there will likely be more telehealth consultations in the next 10 years than there would have been if there hadn't been a pandemic. We've seen schools, universities having to quickly adjust to kind of more of a virtual learning approach as opposed to assuming that people were going to be in the classroom. And that's been a challenge, and a lot of schools and teachers and students and families have struggled with that. But as people understand how to use these technologies, how to conduct classes that are more virtual versus physical, that also is an aspect that's likely going to continue to be important. Again, most kids at some point will go back to school, but for some period of time will continue to be in this virtual world. And 5-10 years from now, there probably will be a little bit more of a hybrid, where sometimes we're there in person, but sometimes we're there virtually. Certainly, we'll see that in the area of offices. People are starting to think about reopening offices, but carefully and safely. But even a year or two from now, some people, I think, will conclude they prefer working remotely, and companies and other organizations will have to figure out how to manage a workforce that likely is somewhat more distributed, and also a kind of a hybrid dynamic where some people are in the office, some people are working remotely. How do you create the right kind of team dynamic and culture, which I think is going to be pretty tricky. So I think there are a number of trends that likely were going to happen anyway. But this 6 months of crisis has kind of been a kind of a shake the snow globe tipping point moment, and some of those trends and some of those technologies are going to accelerate. The only other point I make, though, is, and it's true around the country, but it's also obviously true in DC. Sometimes I hear the idea that hopefully, if we do the right thing around, kind of social distancing and masks in the short run, and then, hopefully a vaccine comes in the next few months, then we'll be able to get back to normal. I don't think we want to get back to normal. Normal actually didn't work for a lot of people. There are a lot of people struggling, kind of before the pandemic. And so how do we use this opportunity to take a step back and create a better, a new normal, if you will, including around entrepreneurship? How do we create a more inclusive approach to entrepreneurship? How do we make sure that entrepreneurs in DC are not disadvantaged versus entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, which is where most of the venture capital is? How do we also be more inclusive in terms of different kinds of people? The reality is, venture capital has not really been distributed broadly to people based on the quality of the ideas. It's more where they live and who they know and what they look like. And so how do you level the playing field there? The data is pretty shocking, frankly, that last year venture capital dollars, over 90% of venture capital went to men, less than 10% went to women, even though women represent half of our population. Similarly, if you look at the statistics around Black entrepreneurs, last year they got less than 1% of venture capital, even though it's about 14% of our population. So, and obviously more so in the DC area. So I'm hopeful that we're, as I said before, we're not just managing through the crisis with the hope that we get back to normal, but imagining a better world, a more inclusive world, a more innovative world, a fairer world, and that we use this as an opportunity to kind of put a stake in the ground and focus on how we can together kind of build in a much different way and a much more collaborative way. The other point that I think has been helpful to understand as it relates to the pandemic, and we've seen this locally, but we've also seen this globally, it's a perfect example of the importance of collaboration. If everybody's doing their own thing, we're not going to solve the pandemic. It requires close collaboration. Obviously, Mayor Bowser's worked closely with the governors in Maryland and Virginia on regional strategies to deal with it. Things like the Greater Washington Partnership have come together to create a more unified view of the region. I think my hope is that mentality doesn't just play into managing through the pandemic, but also working to create a more innovative region that does attract more capital, more talent, more ideas, and does launch the next generation of these third wave startups. So of course, if you're in DC, you care, and particularly if you're the mayor of DC, you particularly care about the DC. If you're in Virginia, you care about Virginia. If you're in Maryland, you care about Maryland. Of course, that makes sense. But recognizing that together we can do things that we can't do separately, I think is super important. And I'm inspired by this African proverb you probably heard, that if you want to go quickly, you can go alone, but if you want to go far, you must go together. I'm hopeful that that sense of going far in partnership, collaboration, and thinking of this as really the greater Washington region will lead to this region rising in the next 10, 20 years as a even stronger startup city. We've certainly seen momentum. I personally lived it over the last 35 years, from that early days when we started AOL, and really weren't a lot many startups here, and there really wasn't much venture capital here, and it was was more government contractors and the government and law firms and things like that. Now we have what is now a growing startup ecosystem in this region, and it's been great to see the progress, but we still have a lot of work to do, and we need to recognize that we're going to attract more talent to the region, we're going to attract more capital to the region if we think more in a collaborative regional context.
I love it. So Steve, along those lines, we're kind of talking about the innovations, the pivots that startups are making. You also talked about the partnerships and ways in which government can play a role in supporting ecosystem development, whether at the local or at the regional level. Are there any cities and governments that you have seen that are getting it right? Obviously, we love to think that in DC we are. So, again, shout out to Mayor Muriel for her hard work in this area. But are there any other kind of example cities and regions that you think have done a great job, either during this pandemic or prior to the pandemic, that we can in the district learn from?
There's many cities, but I would start as you did with DC. It has done a lot to support startups, and Mayor Bowser should be applauded for her effort to do that. Revolution, we've backed more than a dozen startups in DC. We've done some that are seed stage, really early, some more at the venture stage, some at the later growth stage, and we're seeing tremendous momentum. And we think this is going to be one of the great startup regions in the country over the next few decades. But it does require the focus of leadership. And what typically happens, and as we've traveled around the world and seen this, and particularly traveled around the country, we've done these Rise to the Rest bus tours now for 5 or 6 years. Visited 44 cities by bus, and spent a lot of time in each city trying to understand what the dynamics are. It does start with strong leadership from the mayors and the governors in those places, recognizing that startups are the future, that young companies do create most of the jobs. Yes, small business is important to the community and accounts for a lot of jobs. Yes, large companies, Fortune 500 companies are important as well. But if you look at the data, most of the net job creation actually doesn't come from the small businesses or the big businesses. It comes from the new businesses. And so having a economic development strategy focused on new businesses is important. You've got to make sure you're able to help start companies and help scale those companies. It's what's happened typically getting a little bit better, but typically a company would start somewhere, get to a certain size, and then the venture capitalists probably in Silicon Valley say, we'll invest in you, but only if you'll move to Silicon Valley. So you lose that opportunity to create jobs in that community. We have to slow that kind of brain drain, indeed create a boomerang of people returning to cities and starting companies there. We also have to let these companies run a little bit when you have successes in these rising cities. Sometimes the entrepreneurs and investors are a little short-sighted and sell a little early. I haven't had this experience with the AOL, and when things started heating up in the late 90s, there were some offers to buy the company. I remember one from a competitor was buy the company for $70 million, and there were some folks on the board who thought that would be pretty good, kind of good return on their initial investment, and the market was getting pretty competitive with Microsoft, AT&T, a bunch of other people kind of playing. Thankfully, we didn't sell the company, because a decade later, instead of being worth $70 million, it was worth $160 billion. But sometimes, people do sell a little early and don't allow these companies to really kind of grow and achieve their what's possible. But at the core, it really is around collaboration. How do you, at local level, really get people focused on the role entrepreneurs play, celebrate them, which is why I was happy to participate in this event. We need to celebrate entrepreneurship. It is hard to be an entrepreneur. It's scary to be an entrepreneur. It's risky to be an entrepreneur, even more so now given the pandemic. they need, a helping hand. They need, somebody to be a customer or to be a mentor, and also people in the community to say thank you for taking the risk of starting something, because that's our best hope for the future of our community. We can't just be relying on the industries of the past or the companies of the past. We have to focus on creating the industries of the future and the companies of the future. Thank you as an entrepreneur for being part of that. Thank you for doing it here in DC as opposed to feeling like you have to do it somewhere else. And we as a community are not going to just support you with words, although actually that is important in terms of that cheerleading, championing role, but also invest in you so you have the capital to start and scale and help in any way we can, in terms of forging partnerships and other kinds of things to help you take your idea to scale. So that's some of the things that we've seen in different cities as we've traveled around. You got to win the battle for talent. You got to win the battle for capital, and you need to create a strong, thriving culture around risk-taking and innovation and disruption. The last point I'll make is I just encourage everybody, next time they hear an entrepreneur talking about their idea, instead of focusing on what you think might go wrong, what some call the risk factors, why don't you focus on what might go right?
Mm-hmm.
If that idea really took off, what might be possible? In those early days of AOL, most people, frankly, didn't think consumers would ever want to get online. It's like, why would people actually think people are going to buy this thing called a personal computer and connect a thing called a modem and figure out the software and dial into something and spend back then sometimes $10 an hour to be connected. Why would people do that? And you really think that people are going to type a message to somebody when they can just pick up the phone and call them? Now, of course, it seems crazy because we have email and texting and we're used to these things. But in those early days, the internet seemed like a crazy idea. AOL seemed like a kind of harebrained idea. Most people just didn't understand it, didn't get it. Turned out to be a big idea. Airbnb, when they first pitched, I think they pitched 20 investors. They were turned down by every single investor. People said people aren't going to rent a room out in their apartment so somebody they don't even know can stay there. This is ridiculous. Well, they're now one of the most successful hospitality companies in the world. So almost every big entrepreneurial idea starts as what's perceived to be a dumb idea. So I just encourage everybody to suspend a little disbelief. Yes, you have to focus on some of those risk factors, but also focus on the art of the possible. If this idea really gets traction, how might it kind of create an interesting company, create lots of jobs, and how might it even potentially change the world?
Yeah, I will tell you, for me, there's a joke in my household that I type very fast, and people always ask me, where did you learn to type so fast? And I would tell them, in the room, in the dark, in the AOL chat rooms, talking to my friends online. So I have you to thank for my typing. Thank you for that.
Probably your parents weren't as happy about it, but
So Steve, you mentioned and you kind of alluded a little bit to, and actually talked about it full on, diversity in technology. And one of the things that I want to ask and have you talk about a little bit is age diversity in the startup ecosystem and then the startup culture, right? Because inherently someone hears startup, and for them, they may think that this is a 25-year-old person that's creating a new business. This has nothing to do with me. I'm not connected to this. Where do you see people who are older fitting into the startup space?
I think it's a huge opportunity. I do think it's great that entrepreneurship has become more common and things like Shark Tank and other things, as somebody said, popularize the idea of startups, and now people coming out of college, other places have more of an opportunity to potentially start something and raise money. So that's changed a lot, even in my lifetime. So that's all very positive. But it does bother me that the face of entrepreneurship, certainly in this country, isn't very diverse. It tends to be, as you say, kind of 20-something-year-old white guys in Silicon Valley wearing hoodies. And there's some portion of entrepreneurs that are like that, but most aren't. And how do you have a broader perspective, not just assume that all the great companies are going to be launched in Silicon Valley, but they can be launched in DC or other parts of the country? And how do you have a more inclusive approach to backing entrepreneurs so more people in more places have the opportunity to start a company and scale a company and create jobs and really pursue the American dream. And so that's critically important. We also recognize that in a lot of communities, that people don't really have money or don't really have friends and family with money. And so the way that many folks can, particularly in Silicon Valley, can start a company is they worked at Facebook or some place, and they made a little money, and they know some other people, and raise a little round to kind of get started, which is fine, good for them. But for all the people who don't really have that access, how do you create angel funding networks or crowdfunding platforms, or other things, so they too, if they have an idea, have a shot at turning it into a startup, and if it's successful, kind of scaling it. So I just think we need to have a different mindset in terms of entrepreneurs as it relates to age in particular. I actually think in the third wave, the average age of a founder and a CEO is going to be older, because the skill set in the third wave is going to be different than the second wave. I talked a little bit about this earlier, but in the second wave, when it really was about apps running on smartphones, it really was about coding. And so you could have a dorm room startup like Facebook or Snapchat and put a small team together, create an interesting app. If it got popular and spread virally, then you build up your team, and over time you figure out some way to monetize it, sell ads or something like that. That was sort of the playbook for that software-centric, app-centric second wave. Well, the third wave, if it, as I said, in sectors like healthcare, it's not just about the software, it's about systems integration, getting nurses and doctors in the healthcare sector, for example, to embrace it, hospitals to integrate it, health plans to pay for it, regulators to allow it. That's going to require a certain level of credibility and a certain level of diplomacy to build the relationships, build the trust, so that people are willing to take your product or service and use it, and you can navigate some of the complicated issues around policy and regulation. So I think we're entering an era where the conventional wisdom, kind of the face of American entrepreneurship, being largely centered in Silicon Valley, is going to shift, and we're going to see many cities, including DC and this broader Washington region, rise up as a result. We also have a more inclusive face of entrepreneurship that's more reflective of the country we live in. So it won't just be men, it will also be women. It won't just be people in their 20s. It might be people in their 50s, and it won't just be white guys. It will be more of a broad black, brown, et cetera, kind of face of America. That's really important, that we have entrepreneurship and our entrepreneurial communities that reflect the diversity of the country. We obviously have a particular opportunity in the city of DC, as well as this region, to be a leader in more inclusive entrepreneurship. Last point I'll make is that really plays to the strength of DC is in this third wave, where policy regulators are more important, because in food systems and other sectors, healthcare, others, it's critical that we figure out what the right rules of the road are, what things to allow, what things to not allow, how do you make sure things are safe and work before the people are selling them. The center of that here is in DC. Mm-hmm. And so leveraging that as a source of differentiation and saying, as the puck moves from the second wave to the third wave, as the companies that are started are not just about apps on phones, but how you really fundamentally change healthcare delivery and education and food systems and so forth. I think that really advantages DC, but we as a community need to recognize it is changing, and recognize that we need to create that thriving kind of startup community, so people here who do have ideas don't feel like they have to move to Silicon Valley or some other place to really kind of have a shot at taking that idea and scaling. There's no better opportunity in this next 20 years than a place like DC to build on the momentum of the last few decades and what's happened in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship, recognize in this third wave the growing importance of policy, partnerships, et cetera, and how do you continue to strengthen that and help the city continue to rise.
I love it. And Steve, you talk a lot about this in your book. If you want to share anything about your book, Third Wave, anything you'd like to say about that? I know so much of what we've discussed today has kind of been a big part of, the impetus behind you writing the book. You talk about diversity in the book. You talk about the first, the second, and the third wave in the book. Is there any other gem that is in the book that we haven't chatted about today before I go into my next set of questions about raising
Well,
capital?
that wouldn't necessarily be the gem, but I'll tell you why I wrote the book, which is I hadn't written a book, and people had said, 20 years ago, why don't you write a book about, the coming of age of the internet and sort of how AOL grew, or then we merged with Time Warner, and there were some struggles in terms of the, merger and integration of the companies and so forth. Why don't you write a book talking about lessons learned from that merger, which was there were a lot of disappointments there. And I was never that interested in either because I think it's because I've always been more focused on what happens next and not looking in the rearview mirror what happened before. What changed my view and led me to decide to do the book was I did realize, as I said, that some of the lessons of the past were going to help inform the future. And I realized that I had been part with AOL and our team of helping create that first wave of the internet. And then through Revolution, because we've backed now more than 100 companies and dozens of cities, been part of helping to mentor and invest in a lot of entrepreneurs in the second wave. And I realized that this things we talked about, this third wave was actually going to be quite different than the second wave. Things like policy and partners are going to become more important. But actually, the dynamics that are going to drive the third wave were exactly the dynamics that drove the first wave. When we got started in this area, it wasn't about what we did. It was about the partnerships we formed. We had 300 partners that helped build AOL, helped bring America online. When we started, it was still illegal for consumers or businesses to be on the internet. It had been started because of the government funding. It was restricted to government agencies and educational institutions. So we had to work with Congress to pass a Telecom Act to commercialize access to the internet so everybody could be connected. There was a judge in DC, Judge Green, that decided to break up Ma Bell, break up AT&T, and create a number of regional Bell operating companies. That was a pivotal move in terms of unleashing competition, lowering the price of communications that led for the internet to take off. So policy was super important in that first wave. Partnerships were super important in that first wave. Second wave, not so much. Facebook and Google didn't really need to deal with policy. Now they do because they're so big. But in the early days, it was not something even on their radar. They didn't need to deal with partnerships. They just were able to launch their app, or in the case of Google, their search service, and people liked it, and word spread, and they were off to the races. In this third wave, as I said before, the role of policy is going to become more important again. The role of partnerships is going to become important again. So it's going to, some of those lessons from the first wave, I think, are going to apply to the third wave, which is why I decided to write the book.
Love it. Okay, Steve. So want to move into a couple of critical questions that I think anyone who has time with you would want to know, which is about your investment thesis. And you mentioned a little bit about kind of raising capital and how one goes about doing that, whether it be an investment of their own funds, friends and family, angel round, or traditional venture-backed investment. What is your investment thesis? And what tips would you give for someone, particularly during this moment in time where the market is just a little bit more volatile, about raising funds during a moment like this?
Well, our strategy at Revolution is to back entrepreneurs at sort of every step of the entrepreneurial journey. So we have 3 different groups at Revolution. One focused on seed investments, the really early kind of initial checks just to get ideas off the ground. A second group focused on venture investments, where they're raising a few $1 million and they're trying to kind of start scaling what they started. And then also a team focused on growth stage investments, where they're typically investing tens of millions of dollars to take a business that's already demonstrated that there's a lot of promise to it and give it the capital it needs to really turn into a much larger business. So we got seed, venture, and growth, and we're able to basically back entrepreneurs at every stage. So that's part of the strategy. The other strategy is to invest in entrepreneurs we think can change the world. We like big ideas. We like bold ideas. We like things that are really going to take basic aspects of our everyday life and improve them. So when we invested in Sweetgreen, it started up in DC. This is probably now 6 years ago. We said that's really an interesting idea in terms of how fast food is going to give way to more fast casual and healthier fast casual options that offer convenience and quality will get traction. So that was an example there. We also invested another DC company, FrameBridge, that was started, actually helped to get going, focused on framing. How do you create a better, cheaper way and more convenient way for people to access the framing market? We backed Optoro, also in DC, focused on reverse logistics, all the stuff that gets returned to stores, particularly after holidays. What do you do with it? Well, they created a platform to smartly kind of resell those returned products in different ways. We also back Fiscal Note. Our recent investment we just made also in DC is the founder of Blackboard, an educational platform, essentially creating a company to focus on how do you take Zoom as a platform and really adopt it in a much more focused way for classrooms. There's a lot of teachers that have struggled in terms of teaching. The generic Zoom platform doesn't necessarily work well for classroom, kind of dynamics. So that's an example of, again, in DC, a company starting up that's trying to improve the educational system and the outcomes for students who are in this more virtual kind of world. So we look for those different big ideas. We also, goes back to what I was saying earlier, we do believe that partnerships are critical. We do believe that you can go farther if you go together working with alongside others. So part of our understanding when we're looking at businesses is what is their strategy, not just to build on their own, but to create a network of partnerships around their company that will allow them to scale faster and gain more market share and things like that. The last point, obviously critical point, is it's a team sport. Entrepreneurship is not about the founder. It is not about the CEO, even though they get a lot of the attention and are often celebrated. It's about the team that comes together and making sure you have the right skill sets and bring diverse, perspectives to bear, so you really can take that idea and scale it. So it's a mix of different things, whether it be seed, venture, or growth. We're looking for those big, bold, disruptive ideas. We're looking for entrepreneurs and the teams they've formed around them that really have the ability to execute against that idea. I love this quote from Thomas Edison more than a century ago. He was, arguably one of America's greatest inventors and entrepreneurs. And he said, "A vision without execution is hallucination." And so having an idea is important, having a big vision is important, but being able to execute against that is even more important. That comes down to people and teams and setting priorities and executing in a very focused way. So those are some of the dynamics that we look at when we're doing really early investments. We're generally just trying to understand the idea, what the venture stage, they're already up and running. They're generating some revenue. They have some customers, so there's more we can diligence in terms of understanding that. And obviously at the later stage, growth investments is a lot more. You're digging into a kind of a real business. So the mentality our teams bring, obviously is different depending on the stage. But the overarching idea is around backing great entrepreneurs and great teams that really have big, bold ideas, and also doing that with a bias towards not just looking to invest in places like Silicon Valley, which is where most people look to invest, but looking all over the country. And we're particularly focused on DC and this greater Washington region because we're based in DC. So we kind of have home court advantage here, which is why we've now backed more than a dozen companies based in DC.
I love it. And I'm imagining that resiliency is something that you look at when you're looking at entrepreneurs as well. At the beginning of this interview, you talked a little bit about your first failure, but the ability to kind of get back up again, despite whether or not you're going for funding and you hear no, but to stay in the game and to continue to keep persevering with your business and to come back with more demonstrated performance is something I'm sure would be impressive to you or other investors, regardless of whether you wrote the final check or not.
Absolutely. No, you got the entrepreneur. It's a tough journey, and the entrepreneurial journey for most entrepreneurs is not a straight line. It's like a lot of ups and downs, kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I lived that myself with AOL. The first decade, it was really a struggle, and there were a couple of times we almost didn't make it. We had to lay off people, and we're running out of money, and a lot of people thought, well, maybe the internet isn't that big an idea, but even if it is, maybe it's going to take longer to develop, and maybe you guys at America Online just aren't going to make it. And but we stuck with it. We really believed in the idea of the internet. We believed in what our team at America Online was building, and we did persevere. We figured out some way to kind of stay alive, and some way to forge another partnership to give us more scale, some way to tell our story, to get more people to pay attention. And I saw firsthand that the importance of perseverance, the importance of resilience. There were some people in those early days who did quit. They said, I'm not going to be working. I think I'm going to go get a job at like a larger company that's a little safer. And I understood that. But ultimately, they regretted that, because even though it was a struggle, and even though sometimes we certainly had some dark days, we eventually were able to break through. So yeah, we absolutely are looking at entrepreneurs who have that passion, the perseverance, the resilience, so they won't take no for an answer. They won't view a setback as sort of a company ending event. The last story I'll say on that point is we in the late 1980s, our strategy, we were just getting going, was to partner with large PC companies. We didn't have much capital. We were only able to raise $1 million to get started the first couple of years. One of our competitors was backed by IBM and Sears, and they committed $1 billion to launch a company called Prodigy. So obviously, wasn't going to be a fair fight if you looked at money in the bank. So we said, we got to figure out some way to partner with a company to get them to market us, so get them to help kind of build awareness for what we were trying to do. And one of the partnerships we forged was with Apple, and we cut a deal with them, I think it was 1987, to license the Apple brand name to create a service called Apple Link, Apple Link Personal Edition, and we launched that. But then we had some conflict with Apple. They had never licensed their brand name to another company, and they regretted it. There were certain ways they wanted to do things, and we wanted to do things different. For example, we wanted to give software away for free because we thought we'd make money on the monthly subscription fees. They wanted to sell software only in authorized Apple retail stores. So there were those kind of conflicts. Eventually, Apple came to us and said, we wish we hadn't done this deal with you. We wish we hadn't licensed our name. We want to get it back. We want to walk away from this deal. We want to tear up the contract, which was like, yikes. We had just raised money on the idea of launching this Apple Link service in partnership with Apple. Suddenly they're saying, we don't really want you as a partner. So, what are we going to do about that? Well, we kind of hunkered down and figured out a path forward, and negotiated a settlement with Apple, paid us a few $1 million to kind of quietly go away. But then we had to call it something else. We couldn't call it Apple Link, so what do we call it? And we had a little internal competition. We couldn't afford to hire like a branding firm to figure this out. We had to figure it out on our own. And that led to calling it America Online. So we never would have launched America Online as a brand if it wasn't for this Apple deal going kind of astray. That forced us to do some things differently, including coming up with our own brand. So that is just one of many examples I've seen in my own experience, and some of the other companies that we've backed have faced, that you just have to figure out some way to keep going. We've seen this recently in the pandemic. Many of the companies we backed had to quickly adjust. Clear, which focuses on airport security. Well, most people weren't flying on planes, so they had to pivot, and now are also focusing on a health pass, partnering with sports venues and hospitals and others to create a way for people to safely be checked around COVID. Companies like Sweet Green and Cava had to pivot because their restaurants were closed and focus more on delivery and takeout and things like that. DraftKings, which we backed, was focused on sports. Well, most professional sports up until recently were shut down, so they had to pivot and look at some new ways of doing things. So that ability to keep fighting even when the chips are kind of breaking against you, I think is critically important. You have to have that vision. You have to be able to execute against that vision, and you have to stick with it even when times are tough.
So, Steve, that brings me to my final question for our conversation today, which kind of takes us back to the local economy, local government, local institutions, and really the role that creativity plays in creating a world-class city. We're talking about the Smithsonian reopening. Just what role do creative institutions play in making cities destination-based, making them who they are, creating the brands, helping with the brain drain and the retention issues there, things of that nature? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, DC is obviously a terrific city. It's in some way the capital of the free world. It's always been a magnet for people who want to change the world, whether they decide to go into politics or work for a nonprofit or work for a government agency. It's always been that magnet for for young talent. What's happened in the last few decades, I think will accelerate in the next few decades, is also recognizing that some of those people with those kind of great ideas and that energy are going to focus on startups and focus on either joining a company and helping it get to the next level, or perhaps starting a company themselves and creating that strong kind of startup culture. You mentioned the Smithsonian. I'm now the chair of the Smithsonian, and we've got 19 museums, as I'm sure everybody knows, and they've sadly mostly been shut down. We're starting to reopen some parts of it, and that will accelerate in the weeks ahead. But that's also a magnet for people coming. We have about 30 million visitors from around the country, indeed around the world, who come in part to DC because they want to experience the Smithsonian. One of my partners at Revolution has been a partner now for 3 decades. Ted Leonsis is the majority owner of the sports teams and also plays a critical role in creating that magnet dynamic, that energy dynamic in the DC region. Of course, all the businesses in DC, including restaurants and other kinds of things, also are a key part of creating that culture of a sense of uniqueness around DC. So it is a fabulous city. It's why we've chosen to. I initially came to this area a little bit by accident, because I was joining the startup that happened to be based here. I had no real plans to be in DC, but even though that failed and I pivoted and as you mentioned, helped start AOL 35 years ago, even when I stepped down as CEO now, which is almost 20 years ago, my wife, Jean, and I could, I guess, have gone anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, but we decided to stay in this area because we love this area. We see it as a really unique area now through the Case Foundation. Jean is also the chairman of the National Geographic Society. Obviously, I'm spending most of my time on Revolution and backing companies, not just here, but all around the country, but with leaning in a little bit more to the opportunities in DC. This is a fabulous city. Of course, like every city, challenges, more so because of the challenges of the pandemic, a greater recognition recently, sadly, around issues around racism and policing and other things. Great recognition about some of the challenges of income inequality, where some people are doing really well and a lot of people are kind of being left behind. We need to do a lot of things on a lot of different fronts, but the basic starting point for DC as a city and the greater Washington region, there's no better place to really lead the way in this third wave, to really lead the way and being a magnet for people and ideas and capital that will help launch not just the companies of the future, but the industry of the future. And we're all proud to be part of DC and look forward to doing what we can to contribute to the continued rise of the Washington, D.C. Area as one of America, perhaps even one of the world's great startup cities.
Oh, that's a wonderful close. Excellent. And it's all so true. Steve, we are so thankful for you taking the time to join us here for 202 Creates Month as part of Mayor Muriel Bowser's initiative, 202 Creates, which sits in the DC office of cable television, film, music, and entertainment. Again, on behalf of the mayor and on behalf of Director Angie M. Gates, we'd like to thank you for your time and wisdom. This concludes our 202 Creates Month, but you can catch all of the exciting and informative programming that you may have missed at www.202creates.com or check us out on 202 Creates at our Facebook page. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And again, thank you, Steve, for your wonderful comments today.
Thank you all. Stay healthy.